late 1945. Fort Bliss, Texas. The war is over, but the great conflict for technology is just beginning. In a dusty, temporary barracks, a US Army photographer quickly cycles through his queue. He is snapping hundreds of portraits, ID photos of pale, nervous men in newly issued civilian clothes. Each photograph is taken against a white background, and each final print will be stamped with the classified text, "Special Security Clearance." These portraits look like documentation for new American immigrants, engineers, experts, and technicians starting fresh. But they are not immigrants. They are strategic assets. They are members of Adolf Hitler's inner circle of rocket scientists, captured and relocated under the most stringent secrecy in an operation codenamed Paperclip. Among them is a charismatic, visionary engineer whose name just months earlier was synonymous with terror, Wernher von Braun, the chief architect of the V-2 rocket, the weapon that pounded London. The US had captured the man, his team, and 300 railway carloads of his blueprints and components. The pattern interrupt is stark. The men who perfected the war missile are now being positioned to perfect the peace missile. The question wasn't just how to use the technology they brought, but could the United States truly erase their past? Within a decade, these same men, their identities laundered and their histories sanitized, would give America its first long-range missiles, its first satellites, and the technological road to the moon, at a moral cost that was intentionally classified and concealed for years. To understand why America chose to embrace the devil's engineers, you have to understand the terror of the moment. The war was done, but the world had fractured into a new conflict, the Cold War. And the new prize was not territory, but technological asymmetry. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were now desperately racing through the ruins of Germany, engaged in a secret salvage operation to capture the Reich's greatest scientific minds and their components. The US effort was spearheaded by a secretive bureaucracy called the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA. Its mandate was simple and cold-blooded: exploit enemy expertise before the Soviets could. This led to mountains of classified paperwork, files marked Paperclip Project, restricted. The Soviets, meanwhile, were closing in on Peenemünde, the birthplace of the V-2. If they secured von Braun's full team and factory assets, they could leapfrog American missile development by years. The stakes were astronomical. The V-2, which devastated Allied cities, was only an infant in missile technology, boasting a range of just over 200 miles. But the captured German math showed that the next generation of rockets could reach continents. To avoid a future where Moscow held all the strategic cards, the JIOA had to relocate over 1,600 scientists and engineers. This was the dark moral equation of the early Cold War. Could victory truly justify the wholesale adoption of the enemy's most sophisticated engineers? The race began under the strictest secrecy, measured not in months, but in hours. This was not a negotiation. It was a covert logistical scramble. Convoy scenes played out across the shattered landscape of Germany as elite US forces raced to secure personnel. Unlike the chaos of standard surrender, this was a highly controlled process involving coded lists and preemptive capture. The most valuable asset was not the man, but the mind. The moment Wernher von Braun and his key associates were secured, their value immediately superseded their past. They were flown out in a continuous, high-priority stream of planes, departing for staging areas in Texas and New Mexico. This was a technical evacuation of expertise designed to be invisible to both Soviet intelligence and the American public. But this massive transfer of personnel and blueprints required an equally massive act of bureaucratic forgery. The men who had been integral to the Nazi war machine were required to pass legal entry into the United States, which meant scrubbing their records. Their SS affiliations and ties to slave labor, the very elements that defined their history, had to be neutralized. Documents were altered, criminal ties were conveniently lost, and new sanitized biographies were typed up overnight. The goal was to make them legally admissible to the United States under the guise of intellectual necessity, transforming them from prisoners of war to special employees overnight. File folders were quickly stamped, approved for import, strategic value. The phrase itself was an official acknowledgement that the United States was prioritizing utility over justice. Every hour delayed risked a Soviet intercept team arriving first to seize the most valuable mines. The sheer urgency of the American Access operation was a direct measure of the Soviet threat. The United States was literally rewriting its own history, establishing a precedent that the gravity of a geopolitical threat could justify the erasure of war crimes. This deception, built on thousands of altered documents, was the secret foundation of the American missile program. The logistical feat was stunning, the ethical cost still uncalculated. The technical operation was a success, but the moral failure soon began to surface, not in a grand tribunal, but in the tedious labor of the U.S. Army archives. Inside the endless rows of file cabinets, civilian clerks, those not privy to the strategic value stamp, began to notice a repeating anomaly. There was a pattern of identical portraits, men with the same pale, intense expressions, all with new U.S. Army employee numbers. But their background forms, where the biography should have been meticulously confirmed, had curious gaps. Lines that should have detailed party membership were deliberately left blank, or simply typed over. Debrief transcripts provided by the scientists, detailing their wartime work and technical achievements, seemed to contradict the public records that claimed they had simply been cleared of criminal ties. This discrepancy, once quantified, revealed the depth of the deception. The official story of enemy experts cleared of crimes was mathematically impossible. One conscientious clerk noted that the SS ranks had been surgically deleted from at least 132 key files, the same files belonging to the senior command structure of the V2 program. This discovery was the internal ethical crisis of Paperclip. It was the realization that the patriotic American space program was being built on a systemic, documented forgery. The moral contradiction was inherent. To secure the future, the US government had to actively participate in the rewriting of the past, knowingly onboarding men who were directly culpable in Nazi atrocities. The anomaly was a ghost in the machine of history. Someone, high up in the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, had made a cold calculation that the strategic necessity of the space race outweighed the precedent set by the Nuremberg trials. They traded legal and ethical clarity for a head start in the arms race, using a pen as an instrument of historical erasure. The result was a chilling pattern, a perfect portrait of technological genius, deliberately lacking the background lines of moral accountability. The moral anomaly in the file cabinets was one thing, the technical proof in the Pentagon was another. In 1946, a series of meetings were held where Army officers presented the technical gains derived from the captured German data. This was the moment the moral calculation had to be justified by the strategic numbers. The officers laid out the V2 schematics, meticulously translated and verified. They demonstrated the incredible advances in liquid fuel propulsion, the pioneering guidance math, and the sheer altitude record set by the German rockets. The V2 achieved a speed of 3,500 miles per hour, a velocity previously unheard of. The data was irrefutable. It proved that in the realm of rocketry, the Germans were years, perhaps a full decade, ahead of the Allies. The technical presentation was compelling. The officers used imagery of V2 schematics overlaid on preliminary US missile blueprints, showing how the German work was the essential foundation for the emerging Redstone and Jupiter missile programs. They demonstrated that by adopting the Paperclip scientists, America wasn't just catching up, it was inheriting a proven platform. But then came the inevitable confrontation. Ethics advisors and State Department officials objected fiercely. They reminded the Pentagon leaders that these men were not simply talented engineers. They had designed weapons that rained down terror on London, Antwerp, and Paris. More damningly, the advisors knew that the rockets were built using the slave labor of concentration camp prisoners in the Dora Mittelbau underground factory, where conditions were so horrific that more people died building the V2 than were killed by it. The counter-argument, however, was framed in pure strategic geometry. Without them, the Soviets will. The Pentagon officers argued that while the moral cost was high, the cost of allowing Moscow to secure a monopoly on intercontinental ballistic missile technology was existential. They presented a new moral equation in data form, the certainty of a Soviet missile lead, a strategic one, versus the uncertain ethical damage of bringing over the Nazis, a moral 0.5. In the logic of the Cold War, the 0.5 of moral compromise was judged a better deal than the one of technological defeat. The briefing successfully detached the technical utility of the men from their personal history. The question was not who they were, but what they knew. The precision of the V2 launch data, the altitude, the fuel efficiency, the speed, was used to justify the massive human and ethical compromise. The mathematical proof of technological gain was declared superior to the ethical proof of war crimes. The technique, the data, the pure genius of the rocket equation was all that mattered. The decision was made. The engineers were assets, and their past was officially irrelevant to the future of American defense. The test of the technical decision began immediately at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. This was the trial phase for Operation Paperclip, where the value of the adopted German science was to be verified by American launch data. American engineers worked alongside their former enemies, tasked with replicating and then improving the captured German designs. The atmosphere was a bizarre mix of Cold War urgency and scientific camaraderie, but the data quickly validated the JIOA's cold calculation. The first launch tests of the captured V2 components and systems were remarkably successful. The technology worked flawlessly, proving that the US had indeed made the strategically correct trade-off. The trajectory data, the altitude achieved, the flawless ignition sequences, it all provided hard, quantifiable proof that the adoption of these scientists was a technical victory. The success of the American rocket program in the late 1940s and early 1950s became the verification that justified the ethical lapse. The soaring rockets became the visual symbol of the Cold War benefit. However, running parallel to this technological trial was an investigative verification that revealed the full, unforgivable moral failures. While the rockets were soaring, the background checks continued to reveal connections far more damning than simple party membership. Investigators began connecting the dots to the Dora underground factory, where 20,000 prisoners died under forced labor, and even to horrific medical experiments conducted by other Nazi scientists who were also targeted by Paperclip. The contradiction became staggering and quantifiable. Every successful launch, every foot of altitude gained, was tied to thousands of deaths. The data of technological progress ran perfectly parallel to the data of moral atrocity. The scientific gain was directly proportional to the human cost. The US response was a calculated intensification of the cover-up. Rather than expose the truth and risk losing their critical technical assets and handing a propaganda victory to the Soviets, they suppressed the full reports. The intelligence apparatus, having verified the technology, now actively suppressed the moral truth. They created an official shield, designed to protect Wernher von Braun and his key colleagues from any connection to atrocities. This deliberate archival silence was the final step in the Paperclip trial. The verdict was set. The American missile program would be built on the bedrock of strategic memory loss. They protected the asset, and in doing so they codified the blurring of ethical lines that would define Cold War morality for decades. The collision of this secret past with the triumphant American future occurred in 1958. The successful launch of the Soviet Sputnik satellite had panicked Washington, leading directly to the formation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. This marked the moment Wernher von Braun completed his transformation from German war criminal to American national hero. Von Braun, now the central figure in the American space effort, was suddenly everywhere. He stood before television cameras, charismatic, articulate, and completely repositioned as the face of American ingenuity and the path to the moon. He was a symbol of national hope and the ultimate strategic asset. But this iconic image was achieved through an act of profound ethical juxtaposition. Every frame of von Braun, smiling, talking about the future of spaceflight, was built on the deliberate erasure of the past. We can imagine the chilling crosscut, footage of the shining Jupiter C rocket, followed by the dark, claustrophobic tunnels of the Dora underground factory, where thousands perished building its V2 predecessor. When journalists, few and far between, managed to penetrate the official narrative and ask difficult questions, von Braun had his perfect, strategic response. The question would be posed: Dr. von Braun, considering the loss of life at Dora, how do you feel about your past? And the answer, framed for history and for propaganda, was a flawless deflection, severing his present utility from his historical accountability. My concern is the future of spaceflight. This brief exchange was the perfect distillation of the paperclip doctrine. The future, the Cold War race, and the ambition of spaceflight were deemed sufficiently grand to wash away the moral stain. The US had fully committed to the erasure, protecting the technical asset at all costs. The creation of the American rocket team was the triumph of strategic narrative over documented fact, establishing a dangerous moral precedent where technological utility could successfully bypass judicial process. The success of the rocket program was not an isolated incident. It was the proof of concept for a new Cold War technique. Once the moral technical trade-off was proven effective at White Sands, the doctrine began to spread. Paperclip expanded dramatically, not just in numbers, but in scientific scope, becoming a nationwide system of covert scientific collaboration. The initial focus on jet propulsion and rocketry broadened to encompass critical fields like chemistry, biomedical research, and advanced aviation. Agencies across the military and government, from the Army Chemical Corps to the early elements of the National Institutes of Health, began to recruit former Axis experts based on their technical credentials alone, often ignoring or rewriting their war records. The result was that entire American industries became dependent on knowledge derived from captured German and sometimes Japanese research. The technique spread like a silent contagion, echoing in every major development laboratory. Every time the US opened a new research facility or patented a new compound, the silent influence of paperclip was present. And the Soviets, predictably, mirrored the compromise. Their own captured teams were set to work, creating a global scientific competition built on a shared, dark foundation of former enemy expertise. By the 1960s, the moral compromise was no longer a secret logistical operation, but an unstated operating doctrine for the world's two superpowers. It was a strategy of technological supremacy purchased through the systematic erasure of ethical history. The scale-up of paperclip led directly to the strategic outcome America sought. By quantifying the scientific contribution, the technical victory becomes undeniable. The 1,600 scientists brought into the US resulted in hundreds of crucial intellectual properties. They contributed directly to the development of over 700 patents that laid the groundwork for the modern space and defense sectors. Critically, the German rocket team's work was the linear progression from the V-2 to the Redstone missile, America's first tactical ballistic missile, and ultimately to the mighty Saturn V rocket. By 1959, the technology secured through this moral compromise gave the United States a clear missile lead over the Soviet Union. And 10 years later, in 1969, the result was literal: an American on the moon. Operation Paperclip delivered the strategic promise. It allowed the United States to win the technological high ground of the Cold War. But in achieving this, America had fundamentally contradicted its own founding principle of post-war justice. The same nation that championed the Nuremberg precedent, the idea that there could be no amnesty for war criminals, was simultaneously erasing the SS history of its own rocket team. The triumph of the Saturn V was a technical victory purchased with selective memory. The strategic impact of paperclip was not just a lunar landing, it was the institutionalization of a dangerous ethical trade, the belief that the utility of the present can excuse the crimes of the past. The moral price paid was the blurring of a line the world had fought a war to define. Even after the moon landing, the official history of paperclip was carefully managed, leading to several persistent myths that served to keep the moral math balanced. The first myth is that paperclip was a small, isolated and temporary post-war recruitment effort focused only on rocketry. The reality is that the project lasted well into the 1960s, long after the immediate post-war threat had faded. It expanded far beyond the rocket team, feeding crucial state-of-the-art knowledge into aviation, jet propulsion, chemistry, and America's burgeoning biomedical program. It was a structural adoption of scientific expertise, not a brief scavenging operation. The second, more damaging myth is that the scientists imported were thoroughly vetted and officially cleared of any significant Nazi affiliations or war crimes before their arrival. This narrative was essential for public consumption. The fact is that this was a deliberate lie. As the internal WWII documents now prove, the files were actively and systematically sanitized under direct orders from intelligence officials. The official US government position became that the intelligence needed to win the Cold War superseded the judicial need to prosecute war criminals. The files were not cleared by an impartial body, they were rewritten by the very agency that sought to employ them. The security clearances were stamped, but the stamp was forged. This truth reinforces the core theme of the entire operation. The American technological progress of the 1950s and 1960s was built on an active, state-sponsored campaign of historical erasure. It was a massive lie that secured a massive advantage, ensuring that America's journey to the stars began with a profound deception here on Earth. The logic of Operation Paperclip was an exercise in moral geometry, as cold and precise as the launch trajectory of a V-2. It mirrored the challenge posed by the famous Frame 117 in the Cuban Missile Crisis, a problem solved with cold, quantitative precision where the political outcome was determined solely by the technical data, regardless of the human or moral context. The US gained technological victory, securing a missile lead and the moon landing, but it paid a staggering price, the blurring of ethical lines that had been violently carved out by the Second World War. The immediate need to beat the Soviets allowed the government to ignore the Nuremberg precedent, establishing a dangerous doctrine for decades, that utility can and should erase origin. That same utilitarian question echoes today in the modern challenges of technological acceleration. Whether it is the development of advanced AI or groundbreaking biotech, the world constantly faces the paperclip dilemma. Does the promise of massive future utility, the race to be first, justify disregarding the ethical baggage or even the dangerous origins of the underlying technology? The calculation remains the same, the strategic one versus the moral 0.5, and yet the moral weight always returns. From the V2 to the Saturn V, America proved it could escape Earth's gravity, but not the weight of its choices.